All right, so I'm Gaetan Castelline in the product marketing team at VMworld. This is a session on Site Recovery Manager 5 and vSphere replication. I'm actually delighted to see that we have so many people, packed house, so that's great. So Site Recovery Manager 5 is a product that we introduced about a month ago. So it's a brand new product. We actually announced it a month ago. It's not quite available for GA yet, but it is going to be generally available very, very soon. So over the coming weeks, highly likely you'll be able to download the bits, do the upgrades, and purchase this product. So I thought it'd be useful, before I get into the Site Recovery Manager content, to give you a little bit of an overview of what VMworld does from a business continuity standpoint. So we're going to spend a few minutes on that. And the starting point here is to notice what people are actually running on VMworld. So if we go back 3 years ago, VMware was mostly used to run smaller applications, non-business critical applications. Now, if you fast forward to today, we've made a huge progress. So today, it's quite impressive to see that within the VMware customer base, 42% of Microsoft Exchange instances are deployed on vSphere, 67% of SharePoint, SAP is at 28%. We've seen those numbers go up very, very fast over the past couple of years, and it's continued to increase rapidly. And there's kind of a reinforcing effect here. With the deployment of these applications, we see a much greater need for solid, very robust business continuity. And we're also seeing the opposite effect, where once a customer, for example, deploys Site Recovery Manager, you get very good disaster recovery, but for those applications running on vSphere. So that's another incentive to put more of these applications onto the vSphere platform. So there's really a reinforcing effect that we're seeing with this move to business critical apps. Now, if you're going to do business continuity without VMware, there's basically two choices. You can go down the path of deploying siloed solutions, so specific clustering options for specific applications. So for example, if you're deploying SQL, you can deploy a Microsoft cluster, you can deploy database mirroring. If you're going to do Exchange, you can do DAGs, you can do CCR. So there's a number of app-specific options that are available to you. These application-specific options will give you great availability. You can get, for example, continuous availability with rack. But they're complicated, they're expensive, you need to be able to manage them, you need to buy the dedicated standby machines, the expensive software licenses. So they work well, but you need to be able to deal with that cost. There's another option, which is to go down the path of using data protection services. Backup, data replication being two good examples of that. Now that's a lot more cost effective. If you do backup, you're not going to spend nearly as much as if you do a Microsoft cluster, for example. But the downside is you're not going to get as good protection, right? Your recovery point, your recovery time is going to be significantly higher. So you're kind of dealing with the trade-off that has to be made between those two options without VMware. Now, VMware gives you a number of brand new options for high availability. Fundamentally, we have separated the applications from the underlying hardware. And the net impact of that is that we have a new way of doing HA. And what we do in the business continuity space is really split into three different categories. We have protection against local system downtime. So if you have a host go down, we enable you to recover that application quickly. The capabilities we have here include vSphere HA, vSphere fault tolerance, and vMotion and storage vMotion to protect against planned downtime. Then we have a number of capabilities for data protection, backup essentially. So that includes vSphere Data Recovery, that's the VMware backup product, mostly designed for smaller deployments. And then we have the storage APIs for data protection. That's a set of APIs that third-party backup vendors can integrate with to provide better backup capabilities for VMware. And then finally, we have our disaster recovery capabilities. That's really the focus of this session. And that includes vCenter Site Recovery Manager as well as vSphere Replication. Now, as I mentioned, we just launched SRM. This was about a month ago, on July 12th. That was actually the biggest launch in VMware's history. We introduced new releases of vSphere, vCloud Director, vShield, vCenter Operations, which was a few months before that, and Site Recovery Manager. With that launch, we've also introduced significant improvements in all of our business continuity capabilities. So for example, if you look at vSphere HA, we now have the new Fault Domain Manager, which gives you a much more scalable HA cluster that doesn't rely on a master type of architecture. You also now have the heartbeat data store. So if you lose the heartbeat between multiple hosts, that heartbeat can also go through the data store. At the disaster recovery level, we've had a most significant introduction of SRM. That's SRM 5, packed with new capabilities. And that now also includes vSphere replication. And vSphere replication is bundled with SRM. It's a new way to replicate your data between multiple sites that's really designed to enable you to expand your disaster protection. Those are the two sets of capabilities that we're going to be focusing on in this presentation. So as I mentioned, if you kind of take a summary view of what we're doing, if you're looking at traditional solutions, Oracle RAC, Microsoft MSCS, replication, backup, you're faced with that trade-off I was talking about. Backup, very cost efficient, a few $100s per application maybe. Oracle RAC, at the total opposite end of the spectrum, upwards of $100,000 per CPU. Now, if you can deal with that cost, and if you really need continuous availability, RAC is going to give you a great RTO and RPO. Backup, not so much. But so you're really looking at that cost and recovery time trade-off. With VMware, because we're doing things fundamentally differently, we believe that we're breaking that trade-off. We're giving you a cost of availability that's actually much closer to backup or replication, but with a recovery time and a recovery point that is much closer to application-level clustering. So essentially giving you better protection, better availability at a lower price point. All right, so now let's go into SRM specifically. And the starting point here is, even without SRM, vSphere provides a much simpler way to do disaster recovery. So about 5 years ago, we didn't have SRM, but we noticed that many of our customers were actually using vSphere to do simpler disaster recovery. And that's because of three fundamental characteristics of the vSphere platform. On the one hand, vSphere gives you consolidation. That means that you can cut down the costs of the recovery site, something highly desirable because we don't want to be spending too much money on disaster recovery. vSphere also gives you hardware independence. So one of the bigger issues with traditional disaster recovery is that you need exactly the same hardware at the failover site as what you have at the original site. When you think about it, that's almost like building a second house for fire insurance. Very expensive, very inefficient. With vSphere, that hardware dependency goes away. You can now deploy any kind of hardware that you want. It doesn't matter. You can deploy an older x86 box, for example. It really doesn't matter what you're deploying. And then the last thing is vSphere gives you encapsulation. And this is probably the most critical one. Once you're running on vSphere, the application data, the application binaries, the operating system, everything is encapsulated as a set of files. The whole system state is in that set of files. So by simply replicating those files over to the secondary site, you have the whole system that's replicated, and that's very easy to bring back up. That's a lot simpler than having to reinstall an OS, reinstall an application, and then get the data back from backup. Right? So it's a much simpler operation. So it's interesting to note that when people use vSphere, we do a lot of surveys. And when we ask customers, why are you virtualizing? What's the compelling factor for you to virtualize? Obviously, the number one reason is cost, right? Consolidation, cost reduction. But it's interesting that the second reason is consistently to improve business continuity and disaster recovery. So that's the second most frequent reason why people virtualize, and that's because of these capabilities, these characteristics of the vSphere platform. So now we noticed this, and we saw that hey, vSphere is a great way to do better disaster recovery, and we kind of asked ourselves, what can we do to make it even better? Is there anything that we could do to help customers get even better disaster recovery? And we came up with this idea of Site Recovery Manager, a very unique product. There's nothing else really like it on the market. It's a management product that is designed to complement vSphere and give you very simple automated disaster recovery for all of your applications running on vSphere. SRM essentially does three things. First off, it gives you very cost-efficient replication. So in the past, we relied exclusively on storage-based replication. Today, you can use storage-based replication or you can use vSphere replication, which we'll go into a lot more detail in the second part of the presentation. The second thing SRM does is enable you to have very simple recovery plans. So if you've done traditional DR, you know how complicated it is to set up a recovery plan. You probably have a big manual run book that's detailing all the manual steps that have to be done to do a disaster failover. It's manual, so it's error-prone, and it also falls quickly out of sync with what's being deployed. With SRM, you have a centralized recovery plan, very easy to set up. It can actually be set up in a few minutes, and it stays in sync with with all the changes you're making. The third thing SRM does is automation. So once you set up your recovery plan, if you need to do a failover, it's a fully automated process. So that means you're taking out the risk of manual errors again. And then also, very significantly, we enable non-disruptive testing. And this testing thing is one of the key reasons why people buy SRM. Without SRM, it is very difficult to test a disaster failover. With SRM, you can do it non-disruptively as often as you want. Right? So that's a key capability that we enable in this product. So really three things: replication, simple management of recovery plans, and the automation. Now, SRM was introduced about 3 years ago, and since then, we've had tremendous success. So it's been one of the fastest growing products at VMware. Today, we have more than 5,000 customers, most of those using SRM in production. And we've seen SRM in action for many of our customers, whether it's the tsunami in Japan, hurricanes in the US. It's actually helped many customers recover very, very quickly from disasters. And the constant feedback we're getting from customers is, hey, this actually did what it was supposed to. Unlike traditional disaster recovery, where most of the time you don't meet your business objectives, this was predictable and enabled us to recover in the required time. So what's new specifically with this latest release of SRM? Well, there's really three things we're going to be focusing on. The most significant one is vSphere replication. This is a major change. It means that SRM is now no longer just management. It also includes replication underneath. And really the objective of vSphere replication is to enable you to expand disaster protection. So if we look at most of our customers today, they're not protecting all of their applications because of the cost. Getting the storage-based replication is very expensive. vSphere replication, the main objective is reduce that cost and enable you to expand that disaster protection. And then we have automated failback and planned migration. These are two new features of SRM. And the objective with these two capabilities is to provide much better support for the planned migration use case. So we have many customers that use SRM not just for disaster failovers, but also for routine migrations. Well, with automated failback and planned migration, we provide much better support for that use case. Then we have a number of additional improvements in SRM5. Those include, for example, more granular control of the VM startup sequence, new protection side APIs, IPv6 support, a new user interface. We're not going to go into all those new features. There's no time, but there's a lot of things beyond those three main capabilities that we're going to cover today. So if you use SRM5, what do you need? Well, first off, you need two sites. You need the main protected site, and you need a recovery site. On each site, you're going to need a vSphere cluster. That cluster can be vSphere 3.5, 4.x, or 5, you need a vCenter instance. That's very important. You need a separate vCenter on both locations. It has to be vCenter 5. There's a one-to-one mapping between vCenter edition and the SRM edition. Then you need an instance of SRM 5 on both locations. And you need a replication mechanism underneath. So you need a way to replicate that virtual machine data between the two sites. So in the past, we relied exclusively on storage-based replication. That's provided by the traditional storage vendors, EMC, NetApp, IBM, HP, Dell, etc. Those solutions are actually very tightly integrated with SRM, what we call an SRA, Storage Replication Adapter. So even though it's provided by a third party, it is a very well-integrated solution. And now with this latest release, we're providing this new option, which is vSphere replication. So now you can choose how you're going to get that data over to the secondary site. We often get the question of which application can be protected with SRM. Right? Do you have criteria? What's really the limits in terms of what can I protect with this product? And really, it can provide very broad coverage. If you look at the recovery point objective, or how much data you're willing to lose in the event of a disaster, it's very flexible. That's basically going to depend on the replication product that you're using underneath. If you're using synchronous replication, you're going to have zero data loss. So 0 minutes of recovery point, if you will. If you use asynchronous replication, you can choose what the RPO is going to be. You can have a replication schedule of 15 minutes or an hour or a day. That's going to influence how network efficient you're going to be. But it's really up to you and the replication product that you're using. From a recovery time objective, or how long it takes you to actually recover from a disaster, this is not continuous availability. In the event of a disaster, there is going to be some downtime. We are typically looking at 30 minutes to a few hours to recover from a disaster. That's going to depend on how many VMs you have and what your specific configuration is. And so basically what that time is how much time it takes to do the storage steps. That's typically about 15 minutes. And then how much time it takes to start booting up all of your VMs. But so that also means that if you have applications that need continuous availability, you're going to need to use something else. A geo-cluster, global load balancing, for example. But for all the applications that can live with 30 minutes of downtime in the event of a disaster, SRM is a very good option to protect those apps. From a topology standpoint, we're also very flexible. So you can have an active, passive type deployment where you have a dedicated recovery site that's not actually doing anything. It's just a passive site. That's not normally our recommendation because that's not very cost efficient. You have that second site that's just kind of sitting there doing nothing. You can have an active configuration where both sites are actually active, but you're only doing protection in one direction, from site A to site B. Then you can have a bi-directional kind of setup where you have two sites and both sites are protected by each other. That is normally what we recommend because it's the most cost efficient. And then finally, you can have shared recovery sites. So for example, if you have a lot of small remote offices, branch offices, you can have multiple remote offices failing over to one shared central location. So in terms of use cases, the design point for SRM is obviously disaster recovery. So that's the most critical use case. If disaster happens, data center goes down, you need to recover your applications as fast as possible. But we've also noticed over time that many of our customers also use SRM for the planned migration use case. So that, for example, for disaster avoidance. So say a hurricane is coming in, you think there might be some downtime, your data center is still up and running, but you're going to move your virtual machines before the disaster happens to avoid, it's a preventive failover to avoid any downtime. Or you can have the planned migration use case where essentially you might want to avoid downtime due to planned maintenance. You might want to do some global load balancing and move VMs around between data centers every now and again. And for those last two use cases, that's really the use cases why we developed planned migration and automated failback. Right? So keep in mind that when you look at SRM, it's not just about the disaster, it's also about that planned migration use case. We've made a number of announcements this week on DR to the cloud. And this is a major shift for us. So in the past, if you were going to use SRM, you really needed to have those two sites. Now, that can be pretty expensive because you do need to build that second location. And we also have a number of customers that don't have the two sites. Small businesses, for example, sometimes only have one site. However, in the past, it was very difficult for us to enable disaster recovery to the cloud because we were relying on storage-based replication. And service providers were very reluctant to buy all of the possible storage arrays, NetApp, EMC, Dell, HP, to cover everything that their customers might be using. So now with vSphere replication, we've taken that issue off the table because you can now replicate without the need to have identical storage arrays across sites. And some service providers, Island, FusionStorm, Hosting.com, and Veristore, have leveraged that capability, vSphere replication, to offer disaster recovery to the cloud services. And this is very significant because it enables much greater efficiency. You don't need to build that dedicated failover site. And the cloud is actually a great fit for disaster recovery because those resources are going to be idle most of the time. So you can have very high oversubscription ratios and really dramatically cut down the cost of doing disaster recovery. So now these folk service providers are the early adopters, if you will. They're just announcing this week their services are going to be available soon. But we do anticipate this trend to pick up pretty quickly and have a lot more services available over time. All right, so now I'm going to dig deeper on the vSphere replication side. And the starting point here is we talk to a lot of customers, and we notice that on average, if you look at the enterprise side, enterprise customers were protecting 50 to 60% of their VMs with SRM on average. They were going after the tier 1 VMs, in some cases tier 2 VMs, but typically not protecting tier 3 VMs. And the main reason behind that was that cost of protection, right? Buying the software replication, buying the high-end storage capacity on both locations, that made it cost prohibitive to protect everything. And so typically tier 2 and tier 3 applications continue to be protected by backup. Now that's kind of an issue because even though it's a tier 2 application, it's still supporting business functions. So in the event of a disaster, you are going to be impacting business productivity. And then in many cases, SMBs, small sites, remote offices, are also not protected from disaster. They're just protected with backup. And so talking to these customers, the biggest issue was the replication piece, the cost of replication and the cost of storage. So we thought about a way to simplify that and take away some of that pain. And that's how we came up with vSphere replication. vSphere replication is very unique. It's the industry's first hypervisor-based replication product. So some people have called it host-based replication. It's not really host-based replication. What we normally call host-based replication relies on an agent inside the VM and does replication between two VMs. This is not the same. There's no agent inside the VM. This is replication at the hypervisor layer, which means that it's much more scalable and robust than traditional host-based replication. And the whole idea here is to give you more choice. So the intent is not to replace all storage-based replication with vSphere replication. It's to give you one additional option. And the way we think this is going to play out is that storage-based replication will continue to be the number one option for large data centers and for protecting tier 1 applications, whereas vSphere replication will be the better option for smaller sites and for protecting those applications that are lower down in the application stack, so the tier 2 and the tier 3 apps. If you look at the architecture of vSphere replication, it has, so with every copy of ESXi, there is a vSphere replication agent. Okay, so that means that if you're going to use vSphere replication, you need to be using vSphere 5. You cannot use this with vSphere 4 or vSphere 3.5. At the recovery site, you need to deploy a vSphere replication server. That's going to be catching the bits. You can scale it out. Each instance will support about 100 VMs. You can stack them depending on how many VMs you need to protect. It's going to catch the bits and place them in the appropriate data stores and VMDKs. All of this is managed by a vSphere Replication Management server that also interfaces with SRM and vCenter. So it's a well-integrated solution. We often get the question, well, how do I really choose, right? Now we have storage-based replication, we have vSphere replication. How do I choose what I'm going to use? And we think there's really 4 things that you need to think about. One is the vendor, so who's providing you with that replication. On the one hand, you're dealing with a VMware product. On the other hand, you're dealing with a third-party product from EMC or NetApp. Now, even though it's a third-party product, as I mentioned earlier, it is very tightly integrated with the overall solution. But for example, in the case of a support call, you're still dealing with 2 vendors, right? So that's really a decision that you have to make is what do you feel more comfortable with, a single vendor or multiple vendors. From a cost standpoint, vSphere replication is less expensive. You can use non-shared storage. You can do vSphere replication with direct attached storage, for example. But more importantly, you can do this with heterogeneous storage arrays across sites. So you can have a high-end Tier 1 array at the main site and a Tier 2, more cost-efficient array at the recovery site. vSphere replication is also bundled in with SRM, so you no longer have to pay the additional software licenses for the replication. From a management standpoint, vSphere replication is a lot easier to manage. You manage vSphere replication directly from vCenter at the VM level. Right, so management, the replication management is one of the more difficult aspects of SRM today. With vSphere replication, it's done by the vSphere admin. You right-click on the VM, and you choose what to replicate. And then from a performance angle, this is really where storage-based replication has an edge. So vSphere replication has a 15-minute RPO at best. So you can select the RPO anywhere between 15 minutes to 24 hours, but you cannot do synchronous replication. vSphere replication gives you file-level consistency, which is good enough for most applications, but if you need application-level consistency, then you need to use storage-based replication. And then vSphere replication does not interoperate with automated failback, fault tolerance, link clones, or physical mode RDMs. So if you need that very high-performance solution with massive data volumes that will scale extremely well, then that's probably when you want to go with the storage-based replication product. So as I mentioned, the main idea behind vSphere replication is to expand DR protection. And what we want to do is basically enable customers to protect their Tier 2 and Tier 3 applications and protect their smaller sites. If you look at the cost per VM, we think that we're enabling about a 3x cost reduction. So, for example, if you're looking at protecting a large site with storage-based replication, you need the Tier 1 storage capacity at the failover site. You need the replication software and the SRM licenses. You're looking at about $2,000 per VM. With vSphere replication, you're cutting that down because you can use Tier 2 storage at the failover site. You're eliminating those replication software licenses. And if it's a small site, we've also introduced a new edition of SRM at a smaller price point to bring down the overall cost to about $600 per VM. Okay, so that's really the main thing about vSphere replication is that cost reduction. I talked about management, and managing the storage-based replication is often one of the most challenging things about SRM because you're replicating LUNs. And so you're going to have to interface with the storage admin to set up replication at the LUN level with the appropriate replication schedule. And then once you've set up that replication at the storage level, you have to map VMs to LUNs. If you're going into an existing deployment, you're going to have to shuffle VMs around, and that can be a little bit challenging. With vSphere replication, it all becomes a lot simpler. It's the vSphere admin, as I mentioned, right-clicks the VM, selects what to replicate, and that's all that needs to happen. So you're eliminating that complexity of the interaction with the storage teams and also of having to move VMs around to match them to the appropriate LUNs. All right, so now let me talk a little bit about the planning of recovery, disaster recovery. So in the past, most of our customers that were doing traditional DR had these very big, complicated runbooks, and sometimes we were amazed to see how thick and how kind of messy these things could get. But they're very complicated to set up, and there's a lot of potential for error in these runbooks. When you use SRM, you're dealing with a very simple, centralized management interface. You can see here it's basically about a 10-step process. You can set up a recovery plan in a few minutes instead of the weeks normally required for the runbook. Setting up a recovery plan requires essentially 5 steps. Step 1 is to map your production side resources to the failover side resources. So for example, resource pools, vSwitches, VM folders have to be mapped between the 2 sites. Then you select which VMs need to be protected. You choose which low priority VMs to suspend at the recovery site. So for example, you can say, hey, in the event of a disaster, I'm just going to pause all of my test and dev VMs so that I have more capacity for the production VMs. Then you specify the boot sequence of the recovered VMs. You can, for example, say, hey, my database VM needs to come up first, then the application VM, then the web tier VM. And then finally, you can customize IP addresses. So there's a few ways to do this. You can use stretched VLANs if you don't want to re-IP your VMs. If you can't do a stretched VLAN, then you're going to need to re-IP. SRM will re-IP for you. What we will not do is update DNS entries, for example. If you need to do that, then you have to do a custom script that will go and automatically update the DNS entries, and you can embed that script in the recovery plan. So that's an optional step. You can add messages through the user interface and custom scripts depending on exactly what you want to do. And we're eliminating a lot of the steps in the recovery process. A lot of the things are now getting automated. You don't need to mess around with reconfiguring switches. You don't need to manage the storage layer because we will manage everything that needs to happen at the storage layer automatically for you through the storage replication adapter. So really it's become a whole lot simpler. And you also get more flexibility. So for example, a popular option is to set up one recovery plan for the entire data center. So if you lose the whole data center, or if there's like a major power outage, you can move all of your VMs with one recovery plan. You can also define smaller recovery plans for specific applications. So for example, you can set up a recovery plan just for Exchange. You can set up a recovery plan just for SharePoint. So that's very popular also for the planned migration use case. Because in most cases, when you do planned migrations, you're not moving all of your VMs in one single operation. So that flexibility of setting up smaller recovery plans is also something that's very useful. Application mapping is a new product. It's not included in SRM. This is a product that it's a preview. It's not available yet. But it's a product that we are going to be launching. And the interesting thing with application mapping is that it will give you a detailed view of how all of your VMs are interdependent within your infrastructure. So we'll tell you, hey, for example, this application here relies on these 5 VMs, this database, this Java application server, for example, Active Directory. So all the dependencies between your VMs. This is going to be super useful from an SRM standpoint because when you set up your recovery plan, it's always a little bit challenging to make sure that all of the VMs you need for your application are actually included in that recovery plan. So with this, you'll be able to identify all of the VMs you need, and it's really going to help simplify the recovery planning process. All right, so now I'm going to get into the automation piece. And I talked briefly about testing in the beginning of the presentation. I think this is still one of the, if not the most compelling thing about SRM. It's this testing capability. If you don't have SRM, most customers today don't test all that often. So with traditional DR, we see testing happening once a year, maybe, sometimes not even that. And the reason is testing is super complicated. You typically have to book a weekend, do it outside of production hours, get all the staff on hand, and get them to test. And then in many cases, at the end of the weekend, testing's not done but you've got to stop the test because business is picking up again and you've got to get your production applications back up. So there's not a whole lot of testing going on. There's also a stat that says that doing a single test can cost up to $100,000, so it's not cheap. And so customers don't test all that often. And the issue with that is what we call a testing gap. Between the time you test and the time you do your disaster failover, there's a lot of changes that happen. You deploy new applications, you patch VMs, you update OSs. And because of all those changes, what you've documented is probably no longer accurate. And when you do the actual disaster failover, you get surprises and things that don't execute the way you plan them to. And that's going to increase your recovery time dramatically. With SRM, you can test as often as you want, non-disruptively. And the nice thing about that is, on the one hand, it reduces testing costs. You no longer have to book the testing weekend and fly all the staff out to the failover site. All you need to do is push the testing button on SRM, so it's a lot simpler. And because you can test that often, you can identify issues very quickly. If there's a change in the infrastructure, if you've deployed a new VM, it's not included in a recovery plan, you'll notice that when you do your test, you can fix the issue, and it dramatically increases the confidence you have that you'll be able to meet your business objectives. So how do we do the testing? Well, and this is very unique to SRM. You need a virtualized set of applications to do this, and SRM really is the only product that enables this. What we do is we take your replicated LUNs, and we take a snapshot of those LUNs. We don't stop replication, so your replication keeps on going, but we're taking a snapshot of those LUNs. And then we're bringing up the VMs from the snapshot in what we call an isolated network bubble. So the VMs come up, you can actually hand them over to the application teams, you can do testing on them to make sure that your application's up and running, but because it's in an isolated test environment, you're not impacting production applications. So you can do this Monday morning at peak time. There's no issue because there's no impact on production VMs. Once the test is done, we'll clean up the environment. So we're going to shut down those VMs. We're going to delete the snapshots, take out the isolated network bubble, and reset everything the way it was before. So it's all fully automated. In the event of a disaster, what happens? Well, we actually have a heartbeat between the two sites. So we're going to notice that the heartbeat is down. We will not, however, initiate the disaster failover automatically. Because doing a disaster failover is a major business decision. It's going to have a big impact on your systems. There's going to be some downtime in any case, the 30 minutes to a few hours required to recover. So it's not a small decision to make. And in some cases, we could lose the heartbeat because of a network issue. Not because the main site is down, but because there's a communication issue between the two sites. So we don't initiate the failover automatically. We'll tell you that there's an issue, or that we think there's an issue, but you're going to have to go in and manually tell SRM to initiate the failover process. Once you do that, we're going to stop the replication. So we're going to talk to the storage arrays, tell the arrays to stop replication. We're going to present the LUNs to vSphere. We're going to register the VMs within vCenter and start bringing up the VMs according to your recovery plan. So this whole operation, as I mentioned, can take anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours. So some of that time is spent at the storage level to stop the replication and present the LUNs. And then you need to bring up all of the VMs. We'll typically bring up a few VMs at the same time per host. So the time it takes to recover all of your VMs is going to depend on how many VMs you have and then on how many hosts you have to bring those up. This is a screenshot of what happens when you execute or when you test a recovery plan. And so you can see the different steps in the execution. Here, the first step is to shut down the production VMs. We have not done that here because it's a test. So we've left the production VMs up and running. But then you can see all the different steps executing. Storage preparation, shutting down low priority VMs, bringing up the VMs. There's timestamps for each of those steps and the status, whether it was successful or not. This is super useful to document the fact that you have disaster protection. Right? If you have a regulatory requirement that you need a disaster failover plan, you can use this to demonstrate that you have protected your VMs, and you can also use this to show management that you have a recovery plan in place and what the recovery time is going to be. Then finally, I talked about the two new features we've introduced. Planned migration is one of them. So planned migration is used when the main site is still up and running. So you haven't lost the site, your VMs are still active. And that gives us an opportunity to do a much cleaner migration of VMs. What we're going to do is step one is we're going to shut down your production VMs cleanly. So what you get at site A is a number of VMDKs that are application consistent and very clean. Second thing we do is we do a data sync. So we're going to tell the storage array to complete replication of the data between the two sites. At site B, what you then get is those same clean VMs that have been replicated, and then we're going to recover those clean VMs at the failover site. Now, because of the extra steps, because we're doing that shutdown and the data sync, this is going to take longer than a disaster failover. Right? You're looking at a couple of hours. And you can only do this if site A isn't down yet. But when you know ahead of time that you're going to move VMs, this is a great way to ensure zero data loss and application-consistent migrations. In this case, when you use this, you get application-consistent migrations even with vSphere replication. And then automated failback. I think automated failback was the number one requested new feature for SRM. And what this does, I mean, it's kind of obvious from the name, but it enables you to automatically go back from site B to site A. So when we say automatically, it means that on the one hand, we're going to manage all the steps at the storage layer. We're going to tell the storage arrays to reverse replication. That's what we call a reprotect. That's a commitment. When you do that reversal of replication, you're committing that the data on site B becomes the master data set. And then once we've reversed that replication, we will apply the original recovery plan in the opposite direction. Okay, so this is going to be super useful for people that do a lot of back and forth between two sites. For the folks that only use SRM for disaster failovers, disasters don't happen all that often, so it's not going to be used that often. But for the folks that do a lot of back and forth movements, this is going to make their lives a whole lot simpler. All right, so in terms of next steps, I talked about a new edition of SRM. So we now have two editions. We have SRM Standard at $195 per VM and SRM Enterprise at $495 per VM. SRM 4 was actually priced at $450 per VM. So both of these are full-featured products. So you get vSphere replication, you get automated failback, you get planned migration, you get everything I talked about today. The difference between them is that SRM Standard is limited to a max of 75 VMs. SRM Enterprise can be used to protect big environments. Right, so SRM Standard has really been designed for SMBs and for remote offices where there's a lot of price sensitivity, whereas SRM Enterprise is designed for those bigger data centers. We're also introducing a new bundle. I talked in the very beginning of the presentation about the fact that many customers are now deploying business-critical applications on vSphere. And typically, when a customer deploys business-critical applications on the platform, they see a very strong need for three products: vCenter Operations Advanced, vShield app with data security, and Site Recovery Manager. So those three products are typically bought together when customers deploy business-critical apps. So we decided to create a bundle. It's a bundle that we call the Business Production Bundle. It's not available quite yet. It's going to be made available very soon. And it provides a built-in discount when you buy those three products together for business-critical apps. I also want to touch upon the planning process. SRM is not a product that you can just deploy and have it be productive from the get-go. This is a product that requires some planning. You need to do your business impact analysis to identify which applications need to be protected. You need to do your application dependency mapping to identify all of the VMs that need to be protected for those applications. And then you need to design your business continuity solution. Right? Are you going to protect everything with SRM, or are you going to have some geo-clustering? How are you going to protect all of those apps? We can help. We have a set of very solid PSO services to do that, as well as highly specialized competency partners that can help you with that as well. So if you're interested in getting more information about SRM, you can visit us at the booth. We have a number of more technical, more detailed sessions that can give you a lot of very good information. If you're interested in cloud disaster recovery, we have a panel discussion with all of our service providers, as well as a session on the future of cloud disaster recovery. And then there's also a book that I would highly recommend. This book is called Administering VMware Site Recovery Manager. It's written by a guy called Mike Laverick. This is not a VMware employee. It's a book that's been very popular for SRM4, and he's now updated the book for SRM5. It's available for pre-sale in the exhibition hall. So highly recommend that you take a look at that as well if you're deploying SRM. So at this point, I'm going to take questions, and also would like to remind you to fill out a survey on your mobile device if you have a chance to do that. For the questions, we actually have 2 mics. I think the best thing is if you can step up to the mic so everybody can hear the question. Otherwise, I'm going to have to repeat it. Yes?
So with data store DRS clustering we were looking at yesterday, and we could take multiple data stores, obviously, and cluster them together. So let's, for this example, take 3 data stores, put 2 data stores at site 1, and the 3rd data store at site 2, but still presenting them as one logical data store. How would you incorporate that with SRM as far as a failure?
So if I understand you correctly, you're talking about a stretched cluster across 2 sites, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we're seeing stretched cluster deployments. That's mostly used for vMotion and live migration across sites. Essentially, there's a few issues when you want to use stretched clusters for HA. Stretched clusters are not a true disaster recovery capability because there's no orchestration. If you're using active metro clusters at the storage layer, for example, you need to coordinate the VM placement with the primary storage site, right? And so if the primary storage site goes down, HA will not kick in automatically to bring the VM back up on the other side. So it's great for DRS and for vMotion across sites. It's not so great in case a site goes down and you want to do an HA and bring up the VMs on the other side. Okay?
Thanks.
Does the new replication component use compression technologies?
Okay, so does vSphere replication use compression? So vSphere replication does change block tracking. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch the changed disk areas, and when we ship the data, we're only going to ship the latest deltas, right? So depending on the RPO, you're going to be more or less efficient. We don't do data compression, right? We don't do any kind of WAN optimization. If you want to get that, you have to use a third-party product, which we interoperate with, but it's not built into the product itself.
Thank you.
Let me get a question on this side, yeah.
2-part question. First part was, did I understand you to say that you had to have a dedicated virtual center server on each end?
Yeah.
And if so, is the cost of that included in the cost of site recovery manager?
So, no. So you need a vSphere cluster on both sides and vCenter on both sides. Those have to be licensed separately. The site recovery manager license is applied to protected VMs only. So imagine if you have 2 sites and you're only protecting from site A to site B, you don't need to license SRM at site B, right? You only need to license SRM for protected VMs at site A.
Right, but I'm going to have a production virtual center server running in site A normally. So are you saying that we have to buy and build a second virtual center server in site A to support a failover?
Oh, no. So you use the existing vCenter.
Okay, good.
But you also need a licensed vCenter on site B and a vSphere cluster on site B.
Okay, that helps. Thank you very much.
All right, yeah, sure.
From a scalability perspective, it looks like there's about a 2.5x difference in cost between the standard enterprise, with the difference being primarily the number of VMs that you can utilize.
Yeah.
So, is there anything as far as the licensing is concerned to address scalability, where if I purchase the standard for 75 machines and later on need more, do I have to make up that 2.5x delta for the first 75 before I can continue on? Unfortunately,
you do. So, on the licensing side, SRM4 is at $450 per VM. SRM5, you have to look at it as SRM5 Enterprise is going to $495. It includes vSphere replication. So price difference between SRM4 and SRM5 is not that high for a lot more capability. The $195 per VM is really kind of a new low price point we've introduced specifically for SMBs. We wanted to provide a product that was much more cost efficient for SMBs and remote offices. The unfortunate downside of that is indeed that if you're going from the 75 to 100 VMs, you have to upgrade the whole deployment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
One of the things we found with our customers that was holding back the adoption of SRM was the inability to fail back.
Because
and so it was the inability to seamlessly fail back.
Okay.
So the fact that you've introduced that now in SRM 5, I think is, applause.
Thanks.
However, you've also introduced the great feature of vSphere replication bundled in with this, but have then gone and made the two mutually exclusive. So you were saying that you can't automatically fail back if you're using vSphere replication. Is that likely to change?
Yes. So you cannot do automated failback today with vSphere replication. That's more of a timing issue on our side. Okay. So vSphere replication is a brand new product. We haven't had time to integrate that with automated failback. It is something that we intend to fix.
That's good to hear. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, sure.
When can we expect any kind of integration between View and SRM?
Right. So SRM, to be clear, SRM does not support View very well at this point. Okay, so it's possible to do it. It requires a number of workarounds. It's not smooth. It's not easy. Mm-hmm. It is also something that's on the roadmap that we'd like to fix, but today it's not an easy thing to do.
Roadmap like when?
What was that?
Roadmap like when?
I can't tell you when. Unfortunately, I can't. I mean, under ND I might be able to, but I can't tell you publicly. It's yeah.
Okay.
So when you're doing DR sites stuff with SRM and you're using Active Directory and you're doing this testing that's non-disruptive, how do you isolate the application servers with a domain controller and not in the testing without messing up the production Active Directory?
Right.
Do you?
So we do what we call network fencing. All right, so all your switches are virtualized. And so essentially what we do is we create an isolated network environment. Right? It's almost like a VLAN, but it's isolated from the rest of the network. And so that guarantees that there's not going to be any network, any traffic going between that isolated bubble and the rest.
So you would protect a domain controller with SRM. You wouldn't put a domain controller out in the other site. You would want to, at that point, SRM protected domain controller is what you're saying.
You can do that, or some people have an active configuration with domain controllers on both sites.
Well, that's what I'm wondering is how would you then fence, if you put a domain controller out on the other site, how do you fence that domain controller if it's not protected by SRM?
Right, so maybe then you need to take a clone of that VM and launch that clone in that fenced network, right? So it really depends on your specific deployment. We need to take a look at a specific situation, come up with a recommendation. We do have best practices around this on the website if you're interested.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So as a follow-up to the V-replication auto failback, so obviously there's a manual failback method. Is that documented? And more to the point, is there a procedure for doing a manual failback without having to replicate all the data back to the other site?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
So the question is that obviously there's no auto failback with V-replication, right?
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's a documented procedure for manually failing back. And in part of that document, so first question is there a documented feature, a documented procedure? And the second is that as part of that procedure, is there a way to fail back without having to replicate the data all the way back to the other? Like replicate all the data back, or just the change?
I see. Yeah, so the way to fail back is basically you have to go into SRM and set up a new recovery plan, going back from site B to site A. Right? You have to set up a new recovery plan. In terms of the data, so with vSphere replication, there's actually two steps in the replication. There's the initial replication, and then there's the incremental deltas that we send over. For the initial replication, you can actually send the data manually, sneakernet to the other site, so that you don't need to replicate everything over the network. Right? So if you want to do that to be more network efficient, that's something you can do. I also think that if you still have most of your data available on site A, that we will just do the sync between the data you still have available on site A and the one you have on site B.
So where would I find your white papers or procedures for how to do that?
I'm not sure if that specific point is documented. If you have a business card, I'm happy to put you in touch with somebody who can answer that question.
Okay.
Yeah. Question and an observation. Question is heartbeat, vCenter heartbeat. how is that going to integrate with SRM? Because when I fail over, it's going to be to the same vCenter, and how is that going to work out?
So typically you don't use Heartbeat and SRM for the same purpose or the same deployments, right? So SRM has two distinct different vCenter instances, okay? So you don't use Heartbeat between those because they have to be different vCenter instances. Heartbeat is going to be used, within, for example, one deployment. If your vCenter goes down, you want to get it back, but it's not used within the disaster recovery SRM use case, right?
Okay.
Because you do have the two VCs.
The observation. In the hands-on lab, I was trying out SRM5 and had a very disturbing crash where SRM decided to crash in the middle of the planned recovery.
Okay.
And left the primary original VM down, okay. Left the recovery VMs in an SRM locked state, okay. Where it couldn't be powered on.
The shadow VMs, basically, yeah.
And that is very disturbing because if that happens, then there's no recovery steps that I can see. The proctor was not able to help beyond, hey, restart SRM. Well, SRM plugin thinks the recovery was successful. Right. So that's very disturbing because if I use pure array-based replication, I get crash recovery, but at least I know where I am and I can mark the VMs active. SRM, I can't even see where it's marking the VMs inactive. So I didn't see any bug reports on this. So perhaps this would be something to take care of before we start deploying SRM5. And this was the array-based replication.
So I can't comment on what happened in the labs. I mean, I wasn't there.
Just observation that it's a very disturbing crash condition.
So I can't comment. I don't know what happened, but Yes. Okay. Can I take one more question? No. Let me take one more question. Last question.
So we are currently using 4.1 with SRM, and we're already planning to use it for planned migrations.
Yep.
What you introduced in 5.0. So what have you added new in 5.0 that will facilitate using planned migrations?
So it's a new feature, right? So that the fact that we do that clean shutdown of VMs and do the data sync, that did not exist in 4.1.
Yeah, we're just coordinating that ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, manually. So you could do it manually, but now we've automated that.
Okay.
Right? So, so there's a couple of, so you could do, I think you can do everything manually if you wanted to. You could do the clean shutdown of the VMs. Yes. You could tell the storage array to finalize the data sync.
Yes.
But it all had to be done manually. Now it's all automated.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and unfortunately I can't take any other questions, so you can come up here if you want.
Okay.